shock. Hungarian officials in Kyiv as tourists. An uninvited delegation is demanding talks every single day. Orban's hysterical outburst has failed to deliver any results. The dictator is heading toward a serious political setback. The Hungarian leader appears to have misread the situation. The political struggle is slipping out of his control, and the upcoming elections may follow. His hold on power is looking increasingly fragile. His government could soon face a major crisis. Meanwhile, support for Ukraine continues to grow. Attempts by Orban and Fico to block decisions are unlikely to succeed. A massive financial package is already on the table. The details may surprise you. Watch until the end. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. Maria Farafonova here with the latest updates. Orban gave instructions to the Hungarian delegation in Kyiv, try several times a day to arrange a meeting with Ukrainians. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban posted a video on Facebook of a call with Hungary's Deputy Minister of Energy, Gábor, who arrived in Ukraine without an invitation, allegedly to inspect the Druzhba pipeline damaged by Russia. Orban said it was absurd that Hungarians were in Kyiv and could negotiate with everyone except the Ukrainians. The world has never seen anything like this, Orban said, instructing his team to reach out again and again at least once or twice a day. Gábor recorded several videos from Kyiv. According to Hungarian media reports, he said he had met with diplomats in the Ukrainian capital, including the Slovak ambassador, and held some negotiations on energy issues. However, it appears he never actually met with Ukrainian officials. In his latest video recorded near the Hungarian embassy, he said he was waiting for a response from Kyiv. His visit is expected to continue on Friday. Ukraine's foreign ministry said the Hungarian visit to Kyiv had not been agreed upon and described them simply as tourists. Afraid of mobilization, a member of the Hungarian delegation refused to travel to Ukraine. One of the members of the Hungarian group that was supposed to inspect the Druzhba oil pipeline backed out of the trip at the last moment out of the fear of receiving a draft notice. The composition of the commission led by Deputy Energy Minister Gábor was approved by the Hungarian government on March 4th. However, only 4 of the 5 announced participants actually arrived in Kyiv. Journalists found that one member of the group was born in Zakarpattia and holds a valid Ukrainian passport. He feared that due to the strained relations between Budapest and Kyiv, Ukrainian authorities would not make any exceptions regarding mobilization. He did not want to risk being drafted or mobilized during the war, so he simply skipped the trip. Viktor Orban appeared to have seriously miscalculated. In the European Union, officials do not expect Kyiv to agree to an inspection to the oil pipeline, as Ukraine's financial reserves have lasted longer than many initially predicted. Earlier assessments suggested that if the first tranche of the €90 billion credit package did not arrive at the beginning of April, the Ukrainian government would be forced to cut spending because of a budget deficit. Such a scenario would have pushed Kyiv to look for ways to unblock the pipeline in order to unlock the loan, potentially forcing negotiations with Orban. That outcome would have allowed the Hungarian Prime Minister to claim victory in the political confrontation he had initiated. Orban's team was counting on Ukraine running out of financial resources before Hungary's election scheduled for April 12th. This calculation explains the confident and highly public announcement that Budapest would force Kyiv to comply. The strategy of Orban's political advisors, some of whom are believed to have connections with Kremlin-linked networks, was to showcase a demonstration of political strength and a supposed victory over Ukraine right before the vote, when Ukraine was expected to face financial pressure. However, if the latest information coming from Brussels is accurate, that Ukraine has sufficient financial reserves to continue operating without cuts and without the loan until the end of April, then this becomes bad news for Orban's election strategy, which appears to have been based on a faulty calculation. In that case, Orban's declaration of political confrontation with Kyiv could backfire. If the promised victory over Ukraine, namely the repair and reopening of the Druzhba pipeline, does not occur before April 12th, the Hungarian leader will effectively lose the political and economic battle he himself declared. This could negatively affect his ratings, as voters may not see the victory over Ukraine that was promised. As a result, after Orban publicly announced his political war, the Ukrainian government has little interest in granting political points to a pro-Moscow leader. A rapid restoration of supply would therefore not serve Kyiv's interests before April 12th. At this stage, the stronger cards appear to be in Ukraine's hands. What happens after the next political deal will likely become clear only after the Hungarian elections. The veto of Orban and Fico will not work. Ukraine will still receive funds from EU countries to finance its military efforts, even if Hungary and Slovakia continue to block the promised €90 billion loan. EU leaders will meet at a summit in Brussels next week in hopes of convincing Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico to keep their promise to approve the loan. The credit is expected to provide 2/3 of the funding Ukraine needs to continue resisting the Russian invasion until the end of 2027, Politico reports. However, if the two leaders refuse to back down, Baltic and Nordic countries have a plan to provide Ukraine with enough funds to keep it afloat through the first half of the year, according to two EU diplomats familiar with the discussions. The proposed total amount is 30 billion euros. Because this would be bilateral loans, they would not require EU-wide approval.
We are not facing such difficulties with Hungary for the first time. We will provide this loan one way or another.
Separately, Dutch Finance Minister Eelco Heijnen informed his colleagues that his government has allocated 3.5 billion euros per year in bilateral support for Kyiv through 2029. The end for Orban. Only weeks remain before his departure from the post of Prime Minister of Hungary. The opposition is confidently winning in all opinion polls. This means that as early as April, the main pro-Putin lobbyist in the European Union could be removed, and Ukraine will have significantly fewer problems in foreign policy. Details ahead.
Despite the fact that Hungary vetoed the allocation of a 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine, Orban's blackmail will not succeed. The tactics of the pro-Kremlin politician have miscalculated, and Ukraine has enough funds to hold out until the elections in Hungary.
Brussels expects that Ukraine will face a budget deficit only at the end of next month, several weeks later than initially anticipated, since Kiev is hoping that Hungary will lift its veto after the important parliamentary elections on April 12th, which could remove the pro-Kremlin Prime Minister Viktor Orban from office. Initially, EU officials expected that funding for Ukraine would run out at the beginning of April, when the first payment from the 90 billion euro fund was supposed to be made. But the government in Budapest decided to block this plan.
On April 12th, elections will be held in Hungary, and according to the latest polls, Orban is expected to lose. The opposition party TISA has increased its lead among decided voters to 12%. 50% of voters support TISA, while only 38% support Orban's party, Fidesz.
Viktor Orban, realizing that he is currently trailing the opposition in the polls and that Donald Trump's support is not helping him, is taking extraordinary measures to preserve his opportunities, to maintain his power, and his attempts to showcase his special relationship with Putin as the Prime Minister of Peace. Meanwhile, all the other EU countries support a belligerent, corrupt, and dangerous Ukraine. This is part of the election campaign.
By blocking financial aid from the EU, Viktor Orban planned to pressure Volodymyr Zelensky into unblocking the Druzhba oil pipeline. But it seems that the money in the Ukrainian treasury will last until the end of April, and by then the elections in Hungary will have taken place, and most likely the pro-Kremlin politician will lose them. This means that Orban is losing the war he started himself.
In fact, the Hungarian Prime Minister was counting on Kiev running out of resources right before the upcoming elections on April 12th in Hungary. That is precisely what prompted such a confident, pompous, and solemn declaration to force Kiev by any means necessary. Orban's political strategists, some of whom are likely connected to Kremlin structures, were counting on demonstrating political strength and a victory over Ukraine specifically at the beginning of April, right before the elections, when Ukraine would be facing a budget deficit.
It seems that the incident involving the detention of Ukrainian armored cash-in-transit vehicles transporting currency and valuables is also an element of pressure on Ukraine. Today, the Hungarian government issued a decree to confiscate everything from the Oszczad Bank vehicles.
The fact that they did not return these material assets, but at the same time deported the cash couriers, indicates that there was definitely nothing criminal going on. This is simply politics and taking the money while the Druzhba oil pipeline is not operating.
Hungarian Minister of Construction and Transport János Lázár essentially confirmed that the seized funds will be kept as leverage over Ukraine until the Druzhba oil pipeline is unblocked.
We know that the Ukrainians are very nervous. If we are being blackmailed, we can't be so foolish as to give in. We did what we did deliberately, and we will not return the money to them.
But despite such unprecedented pressure from Hungary, Ukraine won't have to suffer Orban's antics for much longer, especially since Brussels seems to be on Kiev's side. And despite the veto, the loan will still be provided on time.
Viktor Orban no longer hides his sympathy for Putin and Russian policy. That is precisely why, in the case of the 90 billion euro loan, as in many other matters, Europe must effectively ensure the implementation of its decisions. Hungary signed this decision. I am convinced that Europe can safely use the 90 billion for Ukraine without waiting for additional approval from Budapest.
Most likely, the Druzhba oil pipeline will not be operational before April 12th. no matter how much Orban wants it or how much pressure he puts on Ukraine. And this will be yet another blow to his already low approval rating ahead of the elections.
Ukraine is preparing to assist its neighbors who are currently under Russian occupation. President Volodymyr Zelensky hinted at the possibility of operations aimed at destroying towers used to guide Shahed drones on the territory of Belarus. At the same time, there are reports of active efforts related to the situation in Transnistria. Here are the details.
Ukraine is trying to help its neighbors who are under Russian influence. Rumors are increasingly surfacing that Ukrainian troops could assist Moldova in deoccupying Transnistria.
They keep their military grouping there. Everything is fine for them there. This could be more of a threat to us, and we can resolve this issue if we set our minds to it. Resolve it radically. But is it necessary to do so? This is where these geopolitical questions begin.
An enclave whose task is both the destabilization of the Republic of Moldova itself and the destabilization of Ukraine. It is already clear that if Russia fails to achieve a decisive victory in the war of attrition against Ukraine, Transnistria's days will be numbered. The self-proclaimed republic will cease to exist and will become an ordinary region of Moldova. And the Russian forces that are on foreign soil will be expelled from Moldova, just as they were expelled from other countries where they tried to plant their bloody roots.
And although Putin publicly speaks about Moldova with deliberate contempt, Russians are constantly trying to interfere in the country's politics and elections to install their candidates and gain full access to temporarily occupied Transnistria.
Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. Quite recently, it was the poorest country in Europe. Now, Ukraine has taken on this distinguished place of honor. For us, the presence of this country within the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, holds no particular value.
They need there to be, how should I put it, a demand here in Moldova, a political demand for a government that can come to an agreement with the Kremlin. What is this for? This is so that the government would essentially turn a blind eye to the ongoing strengthening of the military presence in the Transnistrian region. Because if you turn a blind eye here, in 3 to 4 weeks, there will be 10,000 soldiers armed to the teeth. And then you can imagine what kind of tension that would create in the region. And not only in the southwest of Ukraine, but also in the southeastern region of Romania.
Another country whose elections the Russians are already interfering in, Hungary. Russian political strategists are trying to promote the current Prime Minister Orban for re-election and are building the country's election campaign and policy on hatred towards Ukraine.
We do not want the Ukrainians to drag us into their war. We do not want Hungarians to go and die for Ukraine. We do not want our farmers to go bankrupt. We do not want Europe to turn into their mafia nest. We don't want Hungarian money to be sent to Ukraine. Ukraine is pursuing a very blatant anti-Hungarian policy, and the Ukrainians expect Brussels and their Hungarian proxies to put enough pressure on Hungary to take a position that serves Ukraine's interests. Hungary provides 30 to 40% of Ukraine's electricity imports, and in this sector, the Hungarian government can create difficulties for Ukraine. The Ukrainians had better remember this when they're at various planning tables deciding whether or not to bomb the Druzhba oil pipeline. So let that be on their minds.
President Zelensky has already threatened Orban to stop his sabotage because it's costing Ukrainian lives. Orban in turn made up a fake story about threats to his family.
It's just that the Russians are killing us, and we're supposed to give oil to Orban because, poor thing, he can't win the election without it. We hope that this individual in the European Union won't block the 90 billion, or the first tranche of the 90 billion. And Ukrainian soldiers will have weapons, otherwise we'll give this person's address to our armed forces, to our boys. Let them call him and speak to him in their own language.
The Ukrainians are already threatening my family, my children, and my grandchildren. Everyone is fine, but there's a limit to everything. At a time like this, my family gathers together. I ask them to take it seriously, but not to be afraid. Even though this isn't normal for our everyday lives, we'll figure out how to adapt to this. As we can see, Orban isn't particularly bothered by this. He's not bothered, if only because in an election campaign any means will do, including declaring a neighboring country an enemy based solely on the fact that it doesn't want to allow the financing of a war against itself. One can hope, of course, that once the election campaign is over, the Hungarian Prime Minister will be much more cautious in his statements and will no longer demand that Ukraine agree with all his political visions for the future, including his views on ties with Moscow.
After the deployment of the Oreshnik on Belarusian territory and assistance in coordinating Shahed strikes on Ukraine, President Zelensky also threatened the self-proclaimed Lukashenko with consequences for being dragged into the war.
It's really just Lukashenko's fantasy, his belief that he'll actually be helped if he continues to get dragged into this war. Moreover, we're not in the first year of the war, and it's already a technological war. We don't use our drones against Belarus because we're not at war with them. I emphasize that once again. We're not in the first year of war, and we don't need to worry about manpower and our troops. We can manage many things right from the territory of Kiev. So he needs to come to his senses, as they say, sober up and not get dragged into the war.
And after the president of Ukraine imposed sanctions against Lukashenko and met with the Belarusian opposition, the dictator almost became hysterical.
How can we push some garbage, through journalists or whoever, to the people that everything, you see, would be fine? But these sanctions, Ukraine is in our way. Well, if anyone buys that, it's unlikely to be the Belarusians anymore. Belarusians are pragmatic people. You feed me first, and then you can tell me whatever. Clothe me?
But if we understand that the Belarusians themselves are not at all supporters of the political choice that Lukashenko made for them by usurping power, then indeed pressure on both Moscow and Minsk can lead sooner or later to a regime change, or at least to the point where Putin will not be able or willing to provide Lukashenko with assistance in the event of new protest movements in Belarus. Well, in the end, Putin has already failed to help either Bashar al-Assad or Nicolas Maduro.
Russia is weakening every day, and this is felt primarily by those countries where Russian troops or Kremlin money have managed to infiltrate. And perhaps very soon the peoples of these countries will be able to reclaim what is rightfully theirs.
What do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, like the video and subscribe to stay informed about the main headlines. See you soon!